In case you don't yet know the result of this year's Olympiad in HAIFA, it was won by the United States, who came up at the last moment to put their noses in front of Holland and ourselves, who were closely followed by the rest of the world. That is the rest of the Western world, because the Olympiad was held in HAIFA. The whole of the Russians boycotted the Olympiad for political reasons, and the rest of the Eastern Bloc had to follow suit. It was ironic that the Russian boycott of HAIFA was very closely followed on by the boycott by all the other Eastern countries, which was in turn very closely followed on by President Ford's announcement that the Russians were not masters of the Eastern world, in particular not masters of Poland. This is certainly our best result ever in the Olympiad, which is hardly surprising since we have our best team ever. In fact, I felt that we could have done really rather better than we did. We were rather unlucky in many ways and squandered one or two opportunities, and we could well have been the Olympic champions by now. In fact, the Israelis gave us some recognition of our lack of fortune in the final result by accidentally presenting us with the silver medals for coming second. Well, let's get down to some games. In the past, or in the past that I remember, English players, when confronted by strong opposition and international results, tend to produce rather accurate, technical, stodgy, boring games, scoring lots of draws against grandmasters, but never threatening to beat them. And this was all changed in HAIFA. There was a new English team with a new spirit, and everybody was playing to win every game. And people like Miles in particular, also Keane and Hartston, were playing very sharp imaginative chess, completely unlike their play of even a year ago. I think that the tone was set by our second round match against France. We didn't actually start the Olympiad very well. In the first round we played New Zealand, a team whose prowess at chess doesn't exactly equal the prowess of the All Blacks, and we only managed to beat them 2.5, 1.5, which wasn't a very convincing victory for a team that had aspirations to win the Olympiad. So we had to prove something in the second round against France, and we did it in rather fine style. The person who led the English assault was John Nunn on board fore, and he had this lovely game which I will show you. If you look at diagram 1 on the accompanying leaflet, you'll find the position that occurred sometime after the opening, and this is the position from which we'll start. It's white's move, and he appears to have quite a nice position. His move was pawn to king's rook 4, which threatens to launch a powerful looking kingside attack. Pawn to rook 5, open the king's rook file, transfer the pieces to the rook file and deliver mate, as normally happens against the dragon or the pit or anything which you think at your bishop. So we were actually looking on at John Nunn's game, wondering what he could play in reply, and he suddenly came up with a move that amazed everybody. See if you can find it. It is knight to queen 4. They always tell you in the textbooks that the way to meet an attack on the flank is to counter in the centre. But it's rather nice when you can put a piece on prise like this. Naturally, the knight can't be taken. If pawn takes knight, black simply recaptures pawn takes pawn, and he's threatening the bishop and deadly pin on the king file. So instead of capturing the knight, white replied bishop to king's knight 5 with an attack on the rook. So have another go at finding black's continuation. Well, John Nunn is a very calm player of attacks, and he nonchalantly played queen to bishop 2, leaving the rook for the taking. So white took it, bishop takes rook. Have another go to find black's next move. Well, you'll be surprised by this, but he simply recaptured the bishop. Rook takes bishop. And he can take the knight on knight 3, queen takes knight with check, but in that case white would interpose his queen, and black would be forced either to retreat his queen or swap off into an endgame in which he would have the exchange less. So white has an extra exchange and a move and a piece he can take. In fact, he took the piece, pawn takes knight. If he doesn't take the piece, some nasty things will happen to him. For instance, if he just retreats the knight that is hanging with knight to bishop 1, you suddenly see black pieces streaming in all over the place. First a knight comes into bishop 5, and the queen runs away, say queen to bishop 2. Then another knight comes in to king 4. Now the bishop which is attacked cannot run away, because if it runs away to knight 3 or rook 2, black plays knight to queen 6 check, either knight to queen 6 check, and one of the knights succeeds in picking up the queen. So if you put the white bishop back on bishop 4, the black knight back on king 4, and try and find a reasonable continuation for white, you will be confronted with some difficulties. As a result, white decided not to let himself in for this. So put the knights back on queen 2 and queen 4, and the white knight back on king's knight 3, and the white queen back on king 2. As I said, white took the knight, pawn takes knight, and see if you can find black's reply. Well, we British take things very calmly, and Nunn just replied, pawn takes pawn, again refusing to take the knight with check, but for the same reason as before. White interposes his queen, and John isn't somebody who likes to exchange queens. Now, if you look at this position from white's point of view, he has a rook more, admittedly for a pawn, but he has two pieces hanging, and his king's in a mess in the middle of the board. If he decides to let black take the bishop, and say, again, retreats his knight to bishop 1, black plays pawn takes bishop, and now white has to do something about getting his king out of the centre, so he plays knight to queen 2, threatening to take the pawn on bishop 4 and preparing to get his king out of the way. Black plays knight to king 4, and now white cannot take on bishop 4 because black will take on white's king's bishop 3. If white castles here, trying to avoid trouble, he runs into it. Black plays knight takes knight's pawn, and white cannot take it because of mate in 2. And in fact, the whole white position's fallen to pieces. So, if we go back, put black knight back on queen 2, and his pawn, which is now on bishop 5, back to bishop 4, and reset the white position, uncastle, king on king 1, rook on rook 1, put a white pawn back on king's knight 4, white bishop back on queen's bishop 4, and the knight that's on queen 2 at the moment back to king's knight 3. This is the position we had before, and white realised the mess he was in, and was obviously a player with a sense of humour. He played knight to king 4, realising that black can only take one of his two pieces. Well, he elected to take the knight, because it opens lines in the centre. Pawn takes knight. White recaptured, pawn takes pawn. And now came a little check, not difficult to find. Queen to knight 6 check. White has a choice of interpositions now. If he puts the queen in the way, black can just calmly knock the knight's pawn off, queen takes knight's pawn, allowing black a check on king's bishop 7, because although it looks strong, it's harmless. After, say, queen takes pawn check, king to rook 1, white suddenly finds himself in a total mess, and he's threatened with queen takes king pawn check, he's threatened with knight to king 4, attacking everything, and a check on bishop 6, and if you look around you'll probably find a few more threats as well. So white didn't do that. Let's reconstruct the position. Put white queen back on king 2, white pawn back on his king's knight 4. I'll have to take the black queen off to do that, and put that on black's king's knight 6. Put a black pawn back on his king's bishop 2, and the black king back on knight 1. And you have the position we had before. White in fact interposed the knight here, which seems to hold everything back together for the moment, and threatens possibly to kick the white queen at some time with rook to rook 3. Black's next move was a very sensible one. When a piece is pinned, you attack it. He put his bishop on queen 5. This certainly precludes white from playing rook to rook 3. He'd simply lose the rook to bishop takes knight check. In fact, white was getting into very bad time trouble at this point. Not surprising. when you consider how difficult it is for him to find any constructive moves. And as he was about to lose on time, he came up with pawn to bishop 3, trying to deflect the black bishop from its dominating post. Black took it, of course, pawn takes pawn, and white recaptured, pawn takes pawn. And now switch off, have a look at the position, and then switch off, and try and find black's next move. Well, I don't really want you to think that every time I ask you to switch off, there's an unobvious move coming up. Black simply played bishop takes knight check, but you have to calculate the follow-up carefully, because black obviously had a variety of good possibilities to choose from, but this is the most accurate. White must recap here, queen takes bishop, and if you didn't see bishop takes knight check, or if you didn't consider bishop takes knight check too seriously, have another look at the position and see what you can find. In fact, black played now queen takes bishop's pawn check. And now white interposed his queen with queen to queen 2. This is a losing mistake in time trouble. Well, you can hardly call it a losing mistake, he's dead lost anyway. Instead of playing queen to queen 2, the move he has to play is king to bishop 1. He can't play king to king 2 because he loses a rook to queen to rook 7 check. Sorry, queen to bishop 7 check. And when black does take the rook, the white check on king's bishop 7 is again only 1 check. In fact, after king to bishop 1, which was his only move, black can simply play knight to king 4, and he's got an overwhelming position. The fact that his exchange down is completely irrelevant, and white's whole position is shattered. However, put the black knight back on queen 2, white king in check again on king 1, and now you can put it out of check with queen to queen 2. Black wins by force in this position. Switch off and try and find it. Simple combination of moves. Queen takes queen check, king takes queen, and now a nice little discovered check. Knight to knight 3, check, winning the rook, and white resigned a couple of moves later. For our next game, turn to diagram 2, and this is a position that occurred after the opening of the game between Kovalek, who was white, and Miles. And it's very interesting to contrast this game with the last game that Miles played against Kovalek, which was roughly a year ago in England in the Alexander Memorial Tournament. In that game, Miles had the white pieces and played very accurate technical defensive chess on his first 2 ranks and managed to get a draw. But Miles is a very different player now since he got his Grandmaster title. And this time with black, he went for Kovalek's throat from move 1, or move 3 to be precise. He tried to play a Benko gambit. Benko declined the gambit, thought for a long time, and played something completely new and not really very good. And they reached this position in which Kovalek hasn't got a very good looking position and has used up a lot of time as well. It's black to move, and spurred on by the fact that Kovalek was running short of time, and also probably bearing in mind the reminiscence of the game I just showed you between Nunn and the Frenchman, he came up with the move King's Knight to Queen 4, which as you will see is a very similar sacrifice to Nunn's. White's got to take this knight because he cannot afford to play this position without his black squared bishop. Once he loses his black squared bishop, he's had it. So pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn. Now turn the set round and look for White's best move. It's difficult, isn't it? He found very good defence. Queen to knight 3. Now if black swaps queens and regains his piece, queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, pawn takes knight, white bishop takes the pawn on queen's bishop 4. White shouldn't lose his endgame at all. He's perfectly okay. So if you put the pieces back, white bishop on king's bishop 1, pawn on king's rook 2, queen on knight 3, and a knight on queen's bishop 4, black pawn on queen 4, white black queen on queen's bishop 2. The reason queen to knight 3 is a clever move by white is that it forces black back a bit if he doesn't want to swap queens and take endgame. He has to play queen to bishop 1 if he wants to win. And that's exactly what Miles did. Now white has got less problems to solve than before, but still a lot. Now black looks like getting his piece back in the middle, and the centre's being opened up, and the white king's in the middle of it. Also, what can he do? Well, if he tries to just give back the piece and get castled by ignoring black, say playing bishop to king 2, then he seems to lose by force. Black plays pawn takes knight, white must be captive, bishop takes pawn, which is to pawn down to nothing. And now try and find black's next move. It's rook to queen 5. Quite a startling reply, with two threats. The obvious one on the bishop, and the one you may not have seen, bishop to rook 5, winning the queen. So black's got to take it. Bishop takes rook, pawn takes bishop. Now white's got two pieces hanging, and he's only the exchange up, so he's got to move one of them. If he moves his knight to anywhere except king 2, then he's going to lose his exchange back to knight to queen 6 check, because the rook on, there's a pin on the queen's bishop file when the knight moves. So he must play knight to king 2. And now white has a threat. Bishop takes pawn check, winning the queen. So black plays queen to queen 1. This renews the threat of bishop to rook 5 winning the queen, so white must castle. He wants to do that anyway. Now comes pawn to queen 6. The knight must move, but it can't go to queen to bishop 3 because of queen to queen 5 check, winning the bishop. So it has to go to bishop 4, knight to bishop 4. Now black wins a piece with two simple moves. Queen to queen 5 check, king to rook 1, bishop to queen 3. And black comes out with oodles of material more. Okay, a nice diversion. Now let's go back to the game. Put black bishop back on king 2, the queen on queen's bishop 1, put a black rook on queen 1, I want black pawns on queen 4, queen's bishop 4, put the white king back on king 1, and the rook back to king's rook 1, and knight that's on bishop 4 at the moment, put it on queen's bishop 3, put a bishop on king 3, put the bishop that's on qb4 at the moment back to where it came from, kb1, and a white knight on queen's bishop 4. And we have the game position again. So, white's got to move his knight. Where's he going to move it? Well, it's not very good to put it into knight 6 attacking the queen, because black just replies queen to bishop 3. Oh, I beg your pardon, queen to king 3, threatening both the loose knight and the loose bishop. So instead, white has to play, and Kowalek did play, knight to rook 5. Now, if it's a very complicated position, switch off and have a long think about what your next move would be. The obvious move for black here is pawn to queen 5. Now, if you rejected this move because you saw white had the defense bishop to rook 6, removing one of the pieces from the pin and threatening mate, you would better go back to the drawing board, because black replies queen to king 3 check. White must put the knight in the way, knight to king 2. Black plays queen takes bishop. White now his position is completely wrecked, and if he takes the bishop off, knight takes bishop, then there comes the move you may have overlooked, bishop to rook 5, winning the queen. Note that threat, it's a recurring theme throughout the game. So let's go back, put a white knight back on rook 5, and replace the black bishop it took on black's queen's knight 2. Black bishop back on king 2, black queen back on queen's bishop 1, white bishop back on king 3, the white knight, which is now on king 2, back to queen's bishop 3. This is the position after black has played pawn to queen 5. I suspect that the reason that Miles didn't play pawn to queen 5 is because he feared the reply by white, knight takes bishop. If you didn't see this move, and it's not an easy one to see, then go back to the drawing board and have another look at the position. It's a mind-boggling position. Black can take any one of 3 pieces here. Well, let's deal with the simple one first. If he takes the knight, queen takes knight, then white does have this bishop to rook 6 defence. He plays bishop to rook 6, threatening mate. Black now has no queen check, so he must reply bishop to bishop 3. White now gets another tempo to get his knight out of the attack. Knight to king 4. That threatens knight takes bishop check. So black has to reply king's rook to king 1 to pin the knight. And now white can get castled, I think. He plays bishop to queen's bishop 4. And he's got a piece more and is threatening to castle next move. And the only way black can stop this is to sacrifice rook takes knight check. But it doesn't look very impressive to me. So that eliminates the first of black's possibilities. Let's go back again. Black rook back on king's bishop 1. That's the one on king 1. Black bishop back on king 2. Black queen back on qb1. And the white pieces? Well, put the knight back to qb3. One bishop back to king 3. The other bishop back to king's bishop 1. And the other knight back to queen's knight 7. So, if he doesn't take the knight with his queen, the next best try, or in fact a better try, is to take the other knight. Pawn takes knight. If now white gets greedy, takes the rook as well, knight takes rook. Black plays pawn takes pawn with a big threat. So white has to move the rook. Rook to queen's knight 1. Now comes queen takes the knight back. With our old friend threat bishop to rook 5. White's got a rook more in this position, but he seems to be in a lot of trouble. For instance, if he plays queen back to bishop 2, so that he can meet bishop to rook 5 with pawn to knight 3, then black calmly replies rook to king 1. And this threatens all sorts of things. It threatens bishop to knight 4 or bishop to rook 5 followed by knight to queen 6 check. Or it threatens bishop to bishop 3 and bishop to queen 5 and all sorts of things. And if white tries to oppose queens here with queen to queen 2, well, what would you play here with black? Well, rook down, remember. And the answer is bishop to rook 5 check. Because if white interposes pawn to knight 3, your next move is rook takes bishop check. And white's had it because he can't take that rook because of the knight fork. But did you see king to queen 1? It looks a silly move, but it leaves white still the exchange up with a lot of black pieces hanging. So, if you didn't see king to queen 1, go back and see what you'll do against it. In fact, black has a beautiful winning move here. Queen to king 1, defending his rook and threatening the very fine mate queen takes rook's pawn check. And white's completely helpless against this because, well, I don't see a reasonable defence to it anyway, and if he finds one, black is only the exchange down in this position for 2 pawns. So, let's go back. You've got a lot of work setting up pieces here. Black rooks, king's bishop 1 and queen 1. Black bishop on king 2 and his queen on queen's bishop 1. Take that black pawn that's wandered to the 7th and put it back on queen 5. And that completes the black position. Now let's get the white one back. Put his pawn, which is now on king's knight 3, back to king's knight 2. And put a pawn on queen's knight 2. Put his king back to king 1. Queen back to king's bishop 2. A bishop on king 3. A knight on queen's bishop 3. A rook on queen's bishop 1. And a knight on knight 7. And by the way, I made a mistake earlier. I said the queen on king's bishop 2. It should of course be on king's knight 3. Got that? Okay. So we were analysing pawn takes knight. And I reckon that after knight takes rook by white, he was getting done over. But he's got another move here. He can play simply pawn takes pawn, leaving black with a rook and a knight on breeze. Black replies queen takes knight. And now the point is, white can't take the knight. If pawn takes knight, black plays queen takes pawn check with a bang. And the point is that white can't put his king on bishop 2 again because of, you've guessed it, bishop to rook 5. So he's got to put his king on king 2. At this point you can put your pocket calculators away because with a white king on king 2 he's got no chance of standing the attack at all. Black can just play king's rook to king 1 and it's hopeless. There are millions of threats. So, have to go back again. Put the rook back to kb1 if you bother to move it. Black queen back on queen's knight 2 and give him his knight back on knight 5, which white so erroneously took. Give white pawn back on qb3, put his king back on king 1, and hey presto, we're in the middle of our analysis again. So, white can't take the knight, so he'd better get his pieces out. And in fact, he can just about survive this position. He plays bishop to queen's bishop 4. And now black can't count on any advantage if he doesn't play knight to queen 6 check. Bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop. Unfortunately for white, he has the tempo gaining move bishop to rook 6, threatening mate, which black has to defend with bishop to bishop 3. And now at long last he can castle. And we get a position where black has a slight position advantage. Well, I don't know how much Miles saw of this actually at the board, or whether he was playing entirely on instinct. Whether he rejected pawn to queen 5 or not because he saw this position and reckoned it to not give enough winning chances, I don't know. But it's possible. He sees an awful lot. Anyway, let's go back to the game after this long break. Black rook back on queen 1. That's the one on queen 6. Bishop back on king 2. Queen back on queen bishop 1. And now you can put a bishop on queen's knight 2. And a pawn on queen 4. As for white, uncastle it. Put king on king 1, rook on rook 1. Put his bishops on bishop 1, that's king's bishop 1, and king 3. Demote the pawn on qb3 back to queen's knight 2, and put a knight in its place on qb3. Another knight on queen's rook 5, and black needs one more piece, a black knight on black's queen's knight 5. So we're back in the game again, and Miles didn't play pawn to queen 5. So what did he play? Well, that's your job. He played queen to king 3, which is certainly aesthetically a much nicer move than pawn to queen 5. Leaves one more of another bishop hanging, and gets to grips with the white king immediately. It's in this position that Kovalek didn't play the best defence. Well, that's very difficult to find. In fact, I don't think I'll ask you to find it. It's too difficult. What he should have played is king to bishop 2. And this has a very deep point, which actually he said he saw this idea. He pointed it out to Miles after the game. I think Miles had seen it as well. But he, being short of time, he didn't have the courage or faith to play it. After king to bishop 2, black obviously now does play pawn to queen 5. And white replies bishop to bishop 4. And the point is that after pawn takes knight by black, white replies pawn takes pawn. Now material is equal for the moment, and the white king looks to be in a terrible mess. But black has 2 pieces on prise, and it's not clear. Well, firstly, it's not clear how he saves himself from losing one. If he does lose one, it's not clear how he's going to get compensation for it. And he's got a check on rook 7, which looks promising, because if white interposes the bishop, he gets one of his attack pieces out the way, knight to queen 6 check, winning rook at the same time. But after the queen check, white doesn't play bishop to king 2. He just calmly tucks his king in with king to knight 1. Now it's very tempting to try and construct some mates on this black diagonal, but I don't think you can, because whenever the white knight takes the bishop on black's queen's knight 2, it always stops this bishop to bishop 4 check, so black cannot, for instance, try pawn to bishop 5 in this position. And it is possible that although black has a very good looking position and is at the moment no material down, he could be losing it. Well, perhaps you'd like to look at this yourself, because it's it's far too complicated to analyse on one tape. Anyway, let's get back to the game. Black queen back on king 3. And a pawn on queen 4. Put the white pawn on qb3 back to queen's knight 2 again. Put knight on qb3. White bishop, which is now on bishop 4, back to king 3. And the white king back to king 1. Instead of playing king to bishop 2, Kovalek played knight to queen 1. The intention here is to meet pawn to queen 5 with simply knight takes bishop, and after black takes pawn takes bishop, he can take the rook. So Miles played, well, see if you can find his next move. Well, if you're looking for something spectacular, you were wrong. He played the very strong move bishop to bishop 1, which in fact wins. Although it may not be obvious. After this point, there are no obvious improvements for white. Well, the point of this strange-looking move, very strange move to play when you're when you're a piece down, is to leave the white knight hanging around on rook 5. And it's very badly placed there. And the immediate threat is of course pawn to queen 5, bringing the piece back immediately. So white played king to bishop 2 in this position, which was in fact one move too late, because black now has a winning reply. Try and find it. I'll give you a clue, don't look for anything too spectacular. He played queen to knight 3. This clearly forces the white knight back to knight 3. And if you didn't see queen to knight 3, have another look at the position and see if you can find the follow-up. The next move is very quaint, actually. It's knight to rook 7. A very strange move for winning one, but it leaves white completely defenceless. It's interesting that only when grandmasters play ridiculous moves like knight to rook 7 do they win. When most people play a move like knight to rook 7, they get laughed at. Well, Kovalek was getting down to his last 5 minutes here, and I suppose it wouldn't have helped him if he'd had another 2 hours on his clock, because how does white defend all his hanging pieces? The knight's hanging, and the rook's hanging, and his king's still stuck in the centre. In fact, he tried bishop takes pawn. Well, again, switch off and find black's reply. It's nothing too spectacular. Queen takes knight. And the idea behind Miles's whole concept of queen to knight 3, knight to rook 7, is that if white plays bishop takes bishop in this position, the obvious move, black replies knight takes rook, white plays bishop takes the rook on king's bishop 8, so it threatens mate. Black probably does well to flick in a check here, queen to bishop 7 check. White king runs back to knight 1, and the black rook recaptures the bishop. And we see here that material is equal, and white is completely destroyed because he can't develop his king's bishop. A very amusing position. He can't. All the squares, king 2, queen 3, bishop 4, knight 5, are all covered by black pieces. And if he can't develop his bishop, he can't get his king out of the way. And if he can't get his king out of the way, he can't get his rook out of the way, and he can't do anything. And meanwhile, all black's pieces are in play, and black is nothing down at all. So, Kowalik didn't do this. Let's reconstruct the position. Put a black rook back on queen 1 and a bishop on king 2. Put his queen back on, this is black's queen on queen's knight 6. That's black's queen's knight 6 as well. And the black knight on black's queen's rook 7. And as for the white pieces, bishop on queen's bishop 5, a rook on queen's bishop 1, and his king on bishop 2. So instead of playing bishop takes bishop here, Kowalik played bishop to queen back to queen 4, which threatens mate and so gains a tempo to get the rook out of the attack by the knight. Again, switch off and find black's next move. Well, if your move is bishop to rook 5, which wins the exchange by force, because after white plays queen takes bishop, black can take the rook off, and black has the exchange more, score 90%, because it would probably be good enough to win, but because of his rather powerful bishop on queen 4 and the fact that he's got some coordination at last in his position, white would have 1 or 2 counter chances. But putting the bishop back on king 2 and the white queen back on knight 3, black has an even stronger move. And, well, if you didn't see it first time round, have another go. It's a very simple move. Bishop to bishop 3. But why isn't that bishop on please, you may ask? Well, it's easy but difficult to see. White plays bishop takes bishop, and black plays queen to knight 3 check. Very difficult to see these retrogressive moves, especially over the board. White knight gets in the way, knight to king 3, and now queen takes bishop. And this is much better than winning the exchange, because we now have a position where material is equal. There's no danger to the black position at all. White has no counterplay. His rook is hanging. His queen's knight's pawn is hanging with check. And apart from anything, his black's also threatening pawn to queen 5, to queen 6, to queen 7, and millions of threats. And white's completely lost here. The game continued rook to bishop 5. I won't ask you to find any more moves here for black, because they're by no means unique. He's got thousands of winning moves. In fact, Miles played queen to queen 5, not interested in the queen's knight's pawn. White rook retreated to bishop 2. Now he attacked the pin knight, king's rook to king 1, and it was defended by pawn to bishop 4. And now it's just a question of piling pieces in. Rook to king 5. Kowalek tried to develop something, bishop to king 2, and the other rook on queen 1 to king 1, finishing the pile up on the knight and winning a piece. And the game continued for a few more moves. Rook to queen 1, queen takes knight, check, and, well, we won't give any more. Black's just a piece up here. But that's one of the best games I've seen Miles play. Wonderful game. I can't tell you about HAIFA without going into some of my games, and they're also never lacking in excitement or incident. For the first one, let's go to diagram 3. This is the position I had as white against Pachman. Doesn't look any particularly exciting. Came out of a queen's gambit, and looks rather grey and boring. However, things are about to happen. Well, my move was white, and I played knight to king 5. Point of this move is create some threats on the king side. Well, firstly, if black takes the queen's pawn, knight takes queen's pawn, then white replies bishop takes pawn check and queen takes knight, and he stands a bit better. So instead, Pachman played the best move, bishop to bishop 3, and developed another piece, bishop to king's bishop 4. Again, I'm going to meet knight takes queen's pawn with bishop takes pawn check. So, pawn to king's knight 3 by black, strengthening his position. Now I decided to go in for some complications. Queen to knight 3. Threatens 2 pawns, can't be bad. Or can it? Have a look at the position, see what you'll play here with black. Well, no marks for knight takes queen's pawn, which is what I want him to play. White replies queen takes knight's pawn. And now he's threatening 2 pawns, and he's got his pieces nicely entrenched in the centre, and he's threatening to bring his rook over, queen's rook to queen 1. And he's also threatening the bishop. Okay, so white queen back on knight 3, giving his queen 4 pawn back, which black shouldn't have taken, and give black his queen's knight's pawn back. And the black knight back to QB3. The right move here is knight to queen's rook 4, sacrificing the queen pawn, which I must take. Queen takes pawn. If you didn't see knight to rook 4, try again in this position, see how you'd follow it up. Simple move, bishop to king 3. And the point of black's play is that if white now trades queens, queen takes queen, black king's rook takes queen, then black is winning the queen pawn back by force, and it's got a lot of pressure against white's pieces in the centre and queenside pawns, and the whole white position is looking a bit loose. So put the queens back on the board. White's on queen 5 and black's on queen 1. And here I could have played queen to king 4 here, but I rejected it because of black playing knight to knight 6 and then taking the queen's pawn with his queen. I thought that was a bit drawish. I wanted to make the game more interesting. So, instead, I retreated queen to bishop 3. The idea being that if now black plays knight to knight 6, white queen's rook to queen 1, knight takes queen's pawn, then white queen goes to king's knight 3, and white's avoiding the exchange of queens, and he's got some tactical threats going. He might get some pins on the queen's file, or maybe a sacrifice somewhere on knight 6. However, white queen back on king's bishop 3, the queen's rook back on queen's rook 1, give him his queen's pawn back on queen 4, and that's not going to stay there for long, and black knight back to queen's rook 4. Here Pachman took the q pawn immediately, queen takes pawn, and I continued playing. Well, I thought for some time here, and played rather too ambitiously. And my queen's knight's pawn's hanging, and I ought to play pawn to knight 4, pawn to queen's knight 4, that is, of course, to defend it. However, I saw the possibility of an interesting rook sacrifice, so I went headlong into it, but with great confidence, and it's the confidence with which I played it that enabled me to get away with it. I played queen's rook to queen 1, against which black, of course, took the queen's knight's pawn. Queen takes pawn. Can you see the follow-up I had in mind? Yeah, I had it all worked out. Unfortunately, I didn't work it out correctly. Switch off and have a look. The follow-up is knight takes knight's pawn. Rook's pawn takes knight. And now rook takes bishop. A move that has to be played instantly and with great confidence in order to succeed. So, what happens if black takes the rook? Well, switch off and think about the position. Would you take the rook? Okay, play pawn takes rook. White replies queen to knight 4. Now what do you play? Have another look. When I was analysing this position, I only looked at lateral defences with the rooks. The queen's rook can't go to qb2 because of the white bishop. And if white plays his king's rook to king's bishop 2, well, what do you play with white? The move is not queen takes pawn check, which is met by rook to knight 2, but bishop takes knight to pawn, because black cannot play rook to knight 2 because of queen takes king's pawn check, winning the other rook. So after rook to bishop 2, bishop takes knight's pawn, black is in trouble. If he plays queen's rook to king's bishop 1, trying to give back the exchange to defend his position, then comes bishop takes rook double check, king takes bishop, queen to rook 5 check. And remember that knight that went to queen's rook 4 some time ago? Well, I'm afraid he's lost it. Okay, let's go back. Black rooks on king's bishop 1 and queen's bishop 1, the two bishop 1s. White queen on knight 4, bishop on queen 3, and a black pawn on king's knight 3. Have another go at defending the position. The next defensive try is to try and defend on the black squares with bishop to knight 2. Unfortunately, this gets mated on the white squares. Queen takes pawn check, that's the king's pawn. King to rook 1. Queen takes the other pawn, the knight's pawn, threatening mate. King to knight 1. White can have a draw here if he wants, but he can do better. Queen to rook 7 check. King to bishop 2. Queen to rook 5 check. And now the king can't go back to knight 1 because of well-known mate in 3. And I don't believe the king will last long in the centre either. So, that rules out that defence. Let's go back again. Black king on knight 1. Give him his 2 pawns back on knight 3 and king 3. Put the bishop back on bishop 3. Put the queen back, white queen back on knight 4. So I've ruled out 2 of the obvious defences for you. Now see if you can find the real defence. Well, if you haven't found it yet, it's king's rook to queen 1. But Pachman actually saw this move, but he saw it immediately. He declined the sacrifice, and for an obvious reason, which you'll see later. And the point is, after queen takes knight's pawn check, if queen takes king pawn check, then black just goes king to knight 2. The black king goes to bishop 1. And amazingly enough, it's completely safe there, because if bishop to rook 6 check, then black interposes bishop to knight 2. And notice that way down in the distance there's a queen on that long black diagonal, and it stops white from doing any of these tricky queen to bishop 6 checks or anything like that at all. So instead of bishop to rook 6 check, my first intention was that, oh well, I'd have to play rook to knight 1 in this position to drive the queen off the black diagonal. Then I noticed it got mated off in 2 moves after queen takes rook check. So white has to play in this position pawn to king's rook 4. A good move to play when you've got one. Is it 1 pawn? Yes, 1 pawn for a rook. But in fact, the position is not easy for black to win. I mean, it must be a winning position. I don't believe that the white can conceivably have enough compensation for his rook against best defence. But it's very difficult to find best defence. Anyway, none of this happened, fortunately. You know, some people have got talents for winning lotteries and raffles and all sorts of games of chance like that, and some people haven't. And I've got a talent for winning brilliancy prizes. I won brilliancy prize in the last Olympiad in Nice, and unfortunately, there wasn't a brilliancy prize in this one. If there had been one, I suspect that 3 of the top contenders would have been the 2 games I showed you of by Nunn and Miles, and the one I'm about to show you, which was my best game. Maybe it's the openings I play. I was white against the young Swedish player Schneider, and it went pawn to king 4, black pawn to queen's bishop 4, knight to king's bishop 3, knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn to queen 4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight to king's bishop 3, white knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn to queen 3, fairly normal Sicilian. White bishop to queen's bishop 4, fairly nervous attack. Pawn to king 3, white bishop to king 3, bishop to king 2, white queen to king 2, black now pawn to queen's rook 3, white castles long, queen to bishop 2, bishop to knight 3, black castles, white king's rook to king's knight 1. All these are standard moves in the Velimovic attack. They've been played many times before. That's why I'm going through them so quickly. Black now played a slightly unusual defence, but in fact a very good one. Knight to queen's rook 4. This is a well-known variation where when black doesn't castle, but for some reason it's not so well documented when black has already castled. I don't really know why. Anyway, pawn to king's knight 4, of course. Pawn to queen's knight 4, of course. White pawn to knight 5. This is the right moment to play knight takes bishop check. Rook's pawn takes knight. And the black knight retreats to queen 2. Well, this position wasn't new to me. John Nunn had been telling me what he knew about it just before the game. And he recommended that I play rook to knight 3 here. The point being that the obvious move here is queen to rook 5. To play rook to knight 3 and rook to rook 3 and mate him. But he replies rook to king 1, and then pawn to king's knight 3, bishop to bishop 1, bishop to knight 2, and that position is very difficult to break down. So instead, John's idea was rook to knight 3, which he regards as more flexible. So I innocently played rook to knight 3. I must confess I was surprised by the reply pawn to knight 4. Sorry, pawn to knight 5, which looked very dangerous to me. So, well, what do you play with white here? My reply was knight to bishop 5. If you haven't seen Velimir Brit attack positions before, no doubt this will surprise you. If you have seen them before, won't you surprise you quite so much. Now black must take the knight. If he doesn't, if he plays knight to bishop 4, then white shouldn't chicken out and play knight takes bishop check and move the other knight, but he should continue queen to rook 5, and now if pawn to king's knight 3, white's got a lovely little move. Bishop to queen 4 threatens two very well-known mates, knight to rook 6, and also the queen takes rook's pawn check, followed by rook to rook 3 to rook 8. And black can't stop both of them very easily. Okay, that's just a light aside. White queen back to king 2. White bishop back to king 3. Black knight back to queen 2. And the pawn back to king's knight 2. He took the knight, of course. Pawn takes the knight on black's king's bishop 4. No prizes for white's next move, knight to queen 5. Queen back to queen 1. And white pawn takes pawn. Now the threat is pawn to bishop 6, which wins the bishop. So black played rook to king 1, which is the best defence, gives the bishop a retreat square on bishop 1. Effective white plays pawn to bishop 6 here, bishop 6, bishop to bishop 1, and white's got nothing. So the only move to keep the attack alive is queen to bishop 3. Why not queen to rook 5, by the way? Can you see? Well, queen to rook 5 is an obvious move, but it's met by knight to king 4. And next move, black simply plays bishop takes king's bishop pawn, giving back a piece if necessary, and white's got no attack at all. So, knight back to queen 2, and the white queen to bishop 3, not rook 5. The threat here is, of course, knight takes bishop check, winning the rook in the corner. So black got his bishop out of the way. Bishop back to bishop 1. And white's next move is quite obvious as well. Knight to bishop 6 check. Black can't take this with the pawn, that's suicidal. If pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn check, king to rook 1, and now simpler than trying to construct any artificial looking mates on the king side is just to play queen takes rook here. And I saw no way that black could meet the plan of white tripling on the king's bishop file and playing bishop to queen 4 in some order. It just seemed to be mating all variations. After all, white isn't materially much down here. So, black king back to knight 1, give him his vital pawn on king's knight 2 to protect his king. A rook on queen's rook 1, white queen back to bishop 3. White pawn, which is now on bishop 6, should go back to knight 5, and the white knight on bishop 6 giving check. He took it the right way, knight takes knight. Pawn takes knight. And now try and defend the position for black. You've got a piece more, but your rook is on vase. What do you play? Have a long think about this. The right move here is rook to knight 1. It's the simplest, but the point of this move is to have the defensive move rook to knight 4 later on. So let's see what white does against it. Well, the first try is bishop to queen 4. Then black plays pawn to king's knight 3. White plays pawn takes pawn. And now, if black recaptures rook's pawn takes pawn, then there is queen to rook 5, threatening a horrible sacrifice on knight 6. However, go back. Black doesn't recapture, or not immediately anyway. He instead plays bishop to rook 3 check first, very important. White king to knight 1, and then recaptures rook's pawn takes pawn. And now with queen to rook 5, he just plays king to rook 2, and the attack's all over, it's finished. Take back queen to rook 5, and try and find something else for white. But I don't think you will. And you can try the sacrifice, rook takes pawn check, pawn takes rook, pawn to bishop 7 check, king to rook 2. But there's no obvious follow-up. I mean, he's getting his rook back, but he's still staying a piece down. And it's easy for black to defend. So, go back. Let's have black pawns on king's rook 2, king's knight 2, and king's bishop 2. His bishop back on king's bishop 1, white rook on knight 3, pawns on kb5 and kb6, his king on knight 1, it's the white king on queen, sorry, the white king on queen's bishop 1, and the bishop which is on queen 4 back to king 3. I know it was at this point that I realised that white cannot play bishop to queen 4. That was my original intention. So I turned round and started to look at pawn takes pawn. And obviously black can't take that. So he plays bishop to king 2 in reply. Now, well, analyse this position for yourself and see if you can see how white should continue his attack and how black should defend. My analysis ran as follows. White plays rook to rook 3. Black replies rook to knight 4. This is a key defensive move. It's threatening to play bishop takes king's bishop's pawn, which defends black's position completely. White now sacrifices a rook. Rook takes rook's pawn. And black doesn't accept. If he does, he gets mated. Queen to rook 5 check, and rook to knight 1 check, and all sorts of horrors. But he plays bishop takes king's bishop pawn. Now black is threatening to consolidate, so white gives a check. Rook to rook 8 check. King takes pawn. White only has one move again. bishop to queen 4 check. Now the nice point is that black cannot interpose with the bishop. Why not? Can you see? If bishop interposes, bishop 3, then white simply plays rook takes rook. Black must recapture queen takes rook. Rook to knight 1 check. And white wins his piece back with a tremendous position. So let's go back. White rook back to queen 1. Another one on king's rook 8. Give black his rook on king 1 back. Black bishop on king 2. White has just played bishop to queen 4 check. And black has only one move here, pawn to bishop 3. Only way to defend the check. I started to analyse this position. I had various thoughts about it. The first one was, oh well, white wins. He plays queen to rook 5, threatening all sorts of horrors. And after rook takes rook, rook to knight 1 check. But king to bishop 1. Queen takes rook check. King to bishop 2. And white's still a piece down. And that black king's running away on the white squares to king 3. There's no way you can get at the white squares. Okay, try again. White queen back on bishop 3. White rook on rook 8. The other one on queen 1. Black king on knight 2. And rook on king 1. So what's the next try? Well, the only other try in the position is rook back to rook 5. Black's best defence is now bishop to knight 3, and white rook to king's knight 1. It's a difficult position. In the post-mortem, we analysed some lines and it seemed to be coming out as a draw, amazingly enough. A sample variation is black rook to rook 1, rook to king's rook 1. White trade rooks, rook takes rook. That's the rook on rook 8 he takes. Queen takes rook. Queen to king 4, attacking 2 bishops. Black queen to king 1. If he goes to rook 3 with check, white has bishop to king 3, attacking the queen. And now rook takes bishop check, queen takes rook, queen takes bishop check, and white's going to pick up a lot of pawns for the exchange. And all the variations we looked at seem to be reaching endgames like this of some form or another, most of which are drawn. Okay, well, that's the best I could find for white. He's ending off the draw. However, let's go all the way back. Black pawns 3 in a row. King's rook 2, king's knight 2, king's bishop 2. Rook on king 1. Rook on queen's rook 1. Beg your pardon. Queen on queen 1. Bishops on the 2 bishop 1s. KB1, QB1. White. Rook on king's knight 3, another rook on queen 1, queen on bishop 3, bishop on king 3, and pawns on king's bishop 5, king's bishop 6. My opponent hadn't seen all of this. In fact, to be quite frank, he hadn't seen any of it at all. And he played bishop to queen 2. This is definitely inferior, for a reason that becomes obvious next move. What is white's next move? And the answer is bishop to queen 4. Well, why is it different from before? Why can't black play pawn to king's knight 3? Remember that line? Pawn takes pawn, bishop to rook 3, check, king to knight 1, recaptures, and white can't play queen to rook 5 because of king to rook 2. We had that some time ago. However, things are different. Did you see why? If not, try again. Why are things different? Well, you can try the immediate queen to rook 5, but that won't work because black plays queen to rook 4. And you can't play pawn takes pawn without losing your queen. So if that was your try again. Queen's back on bishop 3 and queen 1. If you want a clue, I told you that the idea of putting the rook on queen to knight 1 was to have a rook to knight 4 defence later. Well, if you haven't found it yet, I'll tell you. It's queen to queen 5. Centralisation, as the books say. And now, you see, if black had played rook to knight 1 instead of bishop to queen 2, he'd have rook to knight 4 in this position. However, he hasn't. And how does he defend against the simple threat of capturing twice on knight 6? And there's this pin on the white diagonal, so he can't defend his king's knight 3 square. And if he moves his king out the way, say king to rook 1, terrible things happen to him. White plays queen takes king's bishop's pawn, and there's some really horrible threats. One of the threats in this position is queen takes bishop check, rook takes queen, pawn to bishop 7, mate. Other threats would include, if putting the queen, rook and bishop back, queen takes rook followed by pawn to bishop 7 check. All sorts of terrible things. He can't let the king's bishop pawn go. So if you put the king back on knight 1, give black his vital king's bishop pawn back, and white queen on queen 5, black's only got one move in this position, and that's to give back the piece with bishop takes pawn, queen takes bishop. But white has a clear advantage here. Or if you go back, bishop on queen 2, white queen on queen 5, pawn on white pawn on bishop 5. Black could try and give back the piece with bishop to king 3, but that's much worse because after pawn takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, white plays queen to knight 7, and black has no move at all. So, let's go back. White queen on bishop 3, black bishop on queen 2, white pawn on kb5, and the black pawn on king's knight 2 still. He should have played pawn to knight 3 because it's his only move. And after queen to queen 5, white is definitely winning. However, he played queen to rook 4 instead, which is not a very good move. Can you see why? The next move was rook takes pawn check. And now if bishop takes rook, queen to knight 4, it's mate. So, king to rook 1. Well, if you didn't see rook takes pawn check first time round, see what your move would be here. Now, don't fall into the trap rook takes pawn check, king takes rook, queen to rook 5 check, because the reply bishop to rook 3 is check. So try again. Put the pieces black, king on rook 1, pawn on rook 2, white rook on knight 7, queen on bishop 3. Have you seen it yet? It's queen to knight 4. Anyway. And I played it. Unfortunately, my opponent resigned in this position because he couldn't see any way to avoid mate. Well, it's quite right, you can't avoid mate, but there's a very, very beautiful mate. The best defensive try for black is pawn to king's rook 3 to give himself a square on rook 2. And can you see this wonderful mate? I was dying to play it. It's rook to knight 8 check, king to rook 2. Incidentally, the reason my opponent resigned was because the simple rook takes bishop wins in this position. But white has much better. Queen to knight 6 check, pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn check, king takes rook, pawn to bishop 7, caramba, it's mate. So in a way it was lucky there was no brilliancy prize, because I'd only have a chance to win it if I was able to play the mate. In fact, the mate will only ever come out in the notes. So, that's it folks, we're running out of time and I'm running out of games. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope we'll have some good ones after the next Olympiad.